Benvenuti a Roma. Welcome to Rome. Rome is a city that doesn't need much introduction because probably everyone is familiar with the major sites of the Eternal City. With the Vatican, home to the Pope, the city with magnificent Christian basilicas alongside the world-famous monuments of ancient Rome. Rome has been chosen to be the location for the canonical or the second phase of the 26th General Chapter from the September 11th to October 7th, 2022. In this brief presentation, we offer you a brief look at the location chosen for the 26th General Chapter, Il Carmelo. Il Carmelo was chosen because of its proximity to the center of Rome and the quality of the services it offers, also taking into account our financial situation. Il Carmelo is a retreat and conference center owned and managed by the Roman province of the Carmelites of the Ancient Observance. It is located on the outskirts of the city, about 5 kilometers from Ciampino Airport and about 35 kilometers from the Fiumicino Airport. At about 150 meters, there is a small train station, Sassone. From where one can reach the main train station in Rome, Termini. There is also a bus stop immediately outside the center with regular services to the nearby town of Ciampino, and taxis are readily available. Accommodation. Originally built as a formation house, the center today has a long history for welcoming organized groups. Many religious congregations have chosen this place as the venue for their chapters and other gatherings. The center has 132 self-contained rooms. The rooms are simple but comfortable, with functional furnishings. Daily cleaning and regular laundry services are provided. Provision is also being made for personal laundry. There is free Wi-Fi available throughout the center. Meals. During our stay, the center will ensure that we are adequately catered for in terms of food. Breakfast is the traditional continental or European breakfast of cereal, fruit, bread, and a selection of cold cuts and cheeses. Lunch and dinner will offer a selection of Italian and international dishes. The center is also experienced in providing for those with special dietary needs, if informed in advance. Tea and coffee will be provided during breaks in the morning and the afternoon. Bar facilities will be available in the evenings. Drinking water is available freely throughout the premises. There is plenty of space for informal gatherings, both inside and outside. There is ample parking space, large open-air spaces for walking, and during our stay, we will have the use of an open-air Olympic-size swimming pool in the premises. Meetings. Plenary meetings of the chapter will be held in a large conference room, situated on the lower level of the center, which we hope to furnish in such a way as to create an atmosphere of togetherness conducive to fraternal sharing. The place is equipped with a video projector, table and radio microphones, facilities for simultaneous translation, and is air-conditioned. The chapter participants will also be able to use smaller rooms for group meetings and other activities. Liturgy and prayer. El Carmelo has 2 chapels, a large one that can accommodate up to 300 people and is fully equipped to respond to any technological needs we may have. The second chapel is a smaller one, with a space for up to 80 people. Both the chapels are fully air-conditioned. To sum up, El Carmelo promises to be a suitable location to host the canonical phase of the chapter. We believe it will provide us with the ambience necessary for a chapter gathering, an ambience that will help us to reflect, pray, discuss, and recreate together. Since the opening session of the canonical phase of the chapter is only months away, we say to you, see you soon here in Rome, hopefully in person.